That we will go into our panel discussion. Jointly by Libby Murphy, who heralds from the Hudson River Estuary Program of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and Gregg, Director of the Office of Economic Development and Strategic Partnership for the City of Kingston. And their topics should be interesting to watch them pull this off jointly from those two different perspectives. Kingston Waterfront Flooding Task Force, a case study for community-driven flooding adaptation. So the floor is yours.
Hello. My name is Libby Murphy. And again, I'm with the Hudson River Estuary Program, which is part of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in partnership with Cornell Water Resources Institute. I'm here with my colleague, Gregg Swanzey from Economic Development in the City of Kingston. Today we're going to share our experiences with the Kingston Waterfront Flooding Task Force, a case study for community-driven flooding adaptation. So first I'll introduce the estuary program and the work we do relating to climate resiliency. Then we'll explain to you the situation of the flooding task force, give you some things you can do, and Gregg will jump in with the municipal perspective. We'll wrap it up and then have time for questions. So the estuary program has a core mission to ensure clean water, protect and restore fish, wildlife, and their habitats, provide water recreation and river access, adapt to climate change, and conserve world-famous scenery in the Hudson River. We do a lot that has to do with climate adaptation. For one, we help manage a program called Climate Smart Communities. Some of you may be representing municipalities that have pledged to the Climate Smart Pledge. I'll speak more to that later, but it basically opens up technical assistance, helps you with funding opportunities, and they're designing it to be somewhat of a certification process similar to LEED certification. So it's pretty cool. Then we also run these flooding task forces. We're working with Kingston as the pilot community, but we'll be adding 2 to 3 more communities soon. We do a lot of watershed resiliency work, watershed planning, green infrastructure, assessing culverts for correct sizing, assessing dams for removal or repair, and trees for tribs, which is a stream buffer restoration. So a lot of these activities help help the watershed to absorb water during flooding events and decrease damage. We also work in biodiversity resilience. So the Kingston Flooding Task Force, it's a great case study. The mayor of Kingston actually called upon this task force to have a 6-month process of reviewing the flooding issues in Kingston and develop a vision for the future. The Kingston waterfront is a very important area. There are marinas, there are restaurants, residents, the wastewater treatment plant, and they deal with flooding all the time. Even when there's a heavy rain event, certain areas will flood, you can't get past certain roads. But clearly, this is a picture from Irene, and also during Sandy they had devastating effects, and businesses were out for weeks, and it took a long time to clean up, and some places still haven't even come up and running again. So it's a very important area to them. It's a big economic driver. So they put together the task force, which is a diverse group of stakeholders, residents, business owners, developers, mariners, and they're coming together to look at the waterfront and try to design a more resilient future and figure out the steps to get there. It's actually a process being led by the Department of State, Scenic Hudson, the Consensus Building Institute, and the Department of Environmental Conservation. So we've been kind of helping to facilitate this group and help them to reach consensus through a variety of tools, which I'll go over later. But we've basically introduced 3 ideas for how you handle flooding. And this could be on a regional level, on a single asset level, like for one building, for a whole strip of assets. And the 3 ideas are fortify, accommodate, and strategically relocate. So Fortify is the hard solution, which is what we've done for a while. where you build a hard structure to just keep the water out. So the levees in New Orleans, a famous example. Here's just a picture of a seawall in Beacon, New York. And these have certain benefits, but they're also, you can continue business as usual behind the wall, but there are also some major drawbacks. Like for one, it gives you a false sense of security, and you're only safe up until the level of that hard structure. And then after that, you're very, very vulnerable. Another issue that Kingston has to think about is the connection with the river and the aesthetic issues of building a hard wall. Then there's the idea of accommodate, which is a little bit more flexible. So here on the left, you see a floodable park concept for New York City, and that's creating a space where water can go and water can infiltrate. But it also is an economic driver because you create a destination when the area is dry. You have a park. On the right, you have Hamburg, Germany, which is designed to flood very frequently. So they basically have closed off the first floor of the buildings, and then they have raised sidewalks. So during the flood, businesses operate as usual on the second floor and above, and people walk on the walkways, but cars simply can't pass. But then when the water goes away, cars can drive like normal. Those are just a few examples. A local example of accommodation is the Steelhouse restaurant in Kingston. The owners decided it was worth it to invest in some accommodation techniques. They have a brick building, so that helps because that can withstand certain floods. But they made sure they have a concrete floor, large doors that open. So when the flood of Sandy came in, they opened their doors to the flood. It goes in and it washes back out. They're up for business 24 hours later, whereas their competitors might be 1 or 2 weeks out. So there's been a clear return on investment and decrease in lost revenue here. And then finally, strategically relocate. There are certain areas you can imagine that you keep rebuilding, you keep trying to keep the waters back, but maybe it's not worth it anymore. Or maybe there's areas that you want to keep open because they are particularly vulnerable to flooding. And again, you can also create destination value. It's not a complete economic loss. You can create a park, areas for kayaks, but they're still very natural. So we did some simulations, and this is using a program called Canvas provided by NOAA, and it's free online. They're a little rough, they're just simulations, but it shows an idea, a few different ideas as far as these different types of adaptation. So here's the East Strand in Kingston. You can see some boats, some businesses, residents above. This is the waterfront at low tide. This is approximately 4 feet of sea level rise on low tide. So this would be an example of Fortify. It's a seawall, so you still have boat access and the buildings are protected behind, but the question is, what if the flood exceeds that level? And also, again, there's that aesthetic impact, that you kind of decrease the connection with the water. This is an example of accommodate, but it also has some fortification in it. This is a vegetated revetment, so it slows the water and protects you to a certain extent, but then you see the buildings in the back have the first floors are armored. So you still can have boats, but it's a little trickier. You have to access them remotely. And then finally, this can be shocking, especially to the people that live there, the idea of strategic relocation. And this would come if they just kept getting hit again and again after floods and they didn't want to pay to continue to rebuild and clean up. That maybe they decide this isn't the best place for the East Strand and maybe move it back a little bit. Some houses and buildings can still be in the back, but then the front, the waterfront is very natural, a green waterfront. You could have some wetlands and still have that destination value, kayaks, maybe trails. So that was something we presented to the task force. This is a list of tools we've been using to help guide their decision. We want them to be empowered to make an informed decision. So we did some participatory mapping. We've done surveys, dot voting for people to decide what they like the most. Do we want to protect this building, remove it, accommodate? Vulnerability and risk assessments, cost-benefit analysis, and then finally a climate-smart planning assessment, which will be available to all the climate-smart communities. So I'm just going to show you a few of them. This was from the first meeting. We have these maps from Scenic Hudson. There's a lot going on here, but just the main thing to notice is The red areas, the darker red, they're going to be inundated with they're basically going to be inundated first. So as the sea level rises, the darker the red, the first to be inundated, and then the yellow shows the 100-year floodplain at those new sea level heights. So this just shows you the very vulnerable areas of the Kingston Waterfront. This is 9W. This is the Strand where most of the restaurants are. And again, I meant to mention this earlier. We're dealing with both sea level rise and storm surge from the Hudson River, but also input from the Rondout Creek. So they have water coming from both directions. So they have the tributary issues and the riverfront issues. So the first meeting we had participatory mapping, where smaller groups sat around these maps, and they were big so they could see in detail, and they pointed out different spots, either because they remember them being flooded or because they're areas that are really important to them, their assets. So this kind of created a little storyline of the waterfront, and all the different community members, how they felt. And what was really interesting was that certain areas were brought up that weren't in the actual flood zones that we modeled, that Scenic Hudson modeled. So they also have issues where water comes from the ground as well. So they have a lot, water coming from all areas. So this is a map we've worked with a lot. And then I'm going to show you the cost-benefit tool, because this is really interesting, and it's so important to make that financial connection in order to see action from the municipality. So we brought in a group called Catalysis, and they do a cost-benefit tool called COAST. And they basically take data, an input data for economic, that's an economic variable. So for us, we use the tax parcel data. Kingston was recently revaluation, so hopefully that's somewhat accurate. And you can see this is Google Earth. So it looks flat, but a lot of these are buildings. What it does is it takes that tax parcel data, and then it takes the depth damage function from the Army Corps of Engineers to predict the damage in different types of storms. So this is a scenario of a 100-year storm in 2013 with no sea level rise. So that's similar to Sandy. Sandy was a little bit worse than that. And this shows the damage. The height of these polygons is the amount of damage that area received. So it's not surprising that a parking lot further back from the waterfront has a very small polygon, whereas the park really close to the waterfront has more damage in the buildings there. This is the East Strand here, those buildings you saw in the simulations. But then you can look into the future at estimated sea level rise and an estimated 100-year storm in the future and see that suddenly all of those boxes get a lot taller. And then this red box is the damage just from the actual sea level rise. So these places will basically be inundated all the time. And these are using sea level rise projections that the task force chose, that they thought was realistic and something they wanted to plan for. So for the whole waterfront, cumulative damage until 2100, first run of the model was estimated to be 126 million. This has not been ground truth, so this could be overestimating, underestimating, but just to show you the relative damages, that's where it's really useful. I bet probably you could guess what this really tall polygon is. Anyone? Wastewater treatment plant. Clearly the biggest economic asset they have to lose there. And in 2100, this model predicts that it will be inundated all the time. That's why it has the red polygon. So this can be a very persuasive point when you're trying to get municipal decision makers to act, when you show this is a lot of money for one city to be looking at. And again, we still have to refine the numbers. So that was just a few of our tools. I think the cost-benefit tool is pretty unique and really important to use. If you're interested in doing this in your municipality, again, it's Catalysis Partners, and they're refining this model, so hopefully it'll be more available in the future. A few things that you can do before I hand it off to Gregg to give you the municipal perspective. If you haven't already, see if your city or town can join the Climate Smart Communities Pledge. We're developing it now, and it's, again, going to offer you free technical assistance, this certification program that guides you through different steps to make your community more climate resilient and gives you a rating based on that. And then, again, it can give you a leg up in certain types of funding opportunities. So we've already had a bunch of villages, cities, and counties take the pledge. If you haven't, these are 3 reports that are really great if you want to study the climate projections and the historical trends. One was the most recent, the New York State 2100 Commission report that the governor had New York State write, and it basically looks specifically at the projections to 2100. So we use this a lot for our sea level rise projections. The center one is responding to climate change in New York State. It's a really great, it's like a full textbook. They have a whole chapter just on water. I recommend you read that if you're interested in it. And then finally, the New York State Sea Level Rise Task Force report, which is just specifically on sea level rise. These are all free and online. Revitalizing Hudson riverfronts. If any of you are representing riverfront cities or towns, this is a great planning document that gives you specific recommendations on how you can think about your riverfront and how you can build it for both protecting the environment, creating economic drivers, and reducing future damage. Very useful guide. And then in general, stay in touch with the Hudson River Estuary Program because we have different funding opportunities available, and we do a lot of work and help with guiding you through green infrastructure projects and other watershed resiliency projects so you can decrease the damage in future floods. The CanVis was the free visualization tool offered by NOAA that I showed you. It's something that I learned in a few hours and made those simulations. In case any of you might want to do the same to show to your town board or someone in your town, could be interesting. And then any day now, the Scenic Hudson will be releasing a sea level rise web viewer. The first version will only be for Hudson Riverfront communities, but we eventually want to expand to the tributary communities as well. But it has high-resolution LiDAR data that shows very clearly what areas could be inundated during different flood and sea level rise scenarios, and that will be free online. And also, we'll be updating our climate adaptation page on our DEC website, which will be coming soon, and we'll offer more resources and a pool of different case studies, funding opportunities, events, etc. So, I'll hand it over to Gregg now.
Thank you for this opportunity. Am I on now? Oh, thanks for this opportunity. I should say I'm a Kingston resident. I live in the Rondout section of Kingston. This is the focus of our city's project has been focusing on the Rondout. Kingston, just by way of introduction,
Okay, all right. Yeah, I'm definitely on now. I'm pretty soft-spoken, so I need one of these things. Anyway, I am from Kingston. I live in the Rondout, and which is and actually a house that's just up the hill, so it isn't bound to be hit by this flooding, but it's pretty close. In fact, for both these events, Irene and Sandy, I went out the door, and a lot of these photographs you see I took from either from the Wirtz Street Bridge, if you know where that is, or actually walking down on the waterfront. Some places I couldn't go because I had to have hip boots and better to even go there. But anyway, Kingston is it's a small city. It's 24,000 people and about 100 miles, a little less north of New York City. It's interesting for us to look at this issue because in Kingston, as Libby said, it's not just tidal because it's on the Hudson River waterfront there, and the Hudson is tidal all the way to the Troy Dam. So we see effects from high tide and low tide and storm surges, but we also are a city surrounded by water because we have the Rondout Creek that flows in, and of course that's coming from the Catskills, draining the Catskills, but also the Wallkill flows into the Rondout before it comes by Kingston. So we've also got that whole drainage, that watershed that is down to northern New Jersey. So a lot of water coming by. In fact, water coming both sides of the Shungum Ridge, if you know where that is. And, But beyond that, there's the Esopus Creek, which forms another border with Kingston. So we've also got that river and that floodplain to deal with. So we're essentially surrounded by water. Anyway, these events were very interesting to us because Irene was an extreme rain event, and so there's a lot of water coming down from upstream. And a lot of these images are that, this maybe you can't see well, but there, in this one, there are these boats here were pulled out of a mooring field that was on the other side of the Rondout Creek, and there's a lot of water flowing across Island Dock, and a lot of pumpkins floating by actually from the Wallkill. So we really did see a huge velocity of water and a lot of volume of water that went by. Sandy, on the other hand, was not really, by the time it came ashore, of course, in New Jersey, but we were lucky up where we lived because it actually went to the west and didn't turn north for a while. So it was not a strong rain event for us, nor was there actually much wind in it. What hit us was the storm surge, and it happened at high tide and spring tide. So actually the water rose higher in Sandy because of the storm surge, but there was little water coming downstream. Now, the perfect storm for us would have been taking Irene and add a Sandy to it, and then you've got storm surge, and then you have more water coming down. That would be a severe event for us, much more extreme than this. So, flooding impacts on the waterfront really, as Libby showed, figures extending vertically. The biggest impact for us really is the sewage treatment plant, likely. See, to give you an idea where that is, it's right in this area here is where the sewage treatment plant is. This being the Rondout Creek here, flowing out to the Hudson. And what we have also are the businesses in here that that weren't impacted because they're a little bit higher. You see all the blue dots are actually a little safer than certainly the yellow dots in the red areas. In this area here, a couple of churches were hit and some residents, and you can see how far up in ashore the floodplain is. This area down here is actually it's a park and a ball field. There's a marina here, and so that was severely hit. It may have forced them actually they're looking to sell the business right now, I think, because of that. And it's also problematic for any designs. We have a developer in Kingston that owns a lot of property along the waterfront, but this is a very problematic place, obviously, to build anything. One thing that's a great feature of Kingston, you can see all these boats along here. This is where all the marinas are. This is the main channel for the Rondout Creek coming down. So this actually is a great hurricane hole where there's a lot of protection from velocity of the water, and as long as you build structures that can accommodate the rising waters, then it's not a bad place to have a marina, really. So one thing we're looking at as we go through all this is, what are some good choices, obviously, into the future, and we're looking out, to 2100. So what can municipalities do? Well, we're in the process of assessing and managing stormwater by not just this process here with the task force, which, by the way, I should mention, I was going to describe the task force a little bit more to you. It really is a partnership of many different entities. Scenic Hudson really brought some funding to the table that was from a donor and also from Lincoln Institute. We've also got the Census Building Institute is helping us, is helping to facilitate the DEC. Department of State is involved, the Office of Communities and Waterfronts. And then the departments within City Hall are there. We've got the Planning Department is involved with wastewater treatment plant, Office of Economic Development. The Kingston Conservation Advisory Council. And then many businesses are in the community, and residents in the community are also on this task force. It's actually more or less anywhere from 24 to 36 individuals who are working hard in its public meetings. So there's a lot of interaction in the community to make this happen. So anyway, in terms of what we're doing to assess and manage the stormwater, back to that, we have some other things going on in Kingston. This is very fortuitous that this task force would come together to look at flooding, because it so happens we have other grants to do other work at the moment. One is a DOS grant for looking at stormwater management in this central area of the waterfront there. So looking at the infrastructure, the stormwater infrastructure, are the pipes big enough? And what happens when we have a big rain event or a surge event or both, and how to really, should we separate out the infrastructure? Interesting strategies going forward, because we've had recurring problems of flooding driven by different things. Malone and Brummer taking on that study, the engineering firm. We're also looking at a place to accommodate more activity down here, because it's a active business district. We need parking. So where would you put parking in here now, especially in light of this? Well, it's fortuitous that that study we're doing now is taking place this time, because I think we'll have a better design, because we're going to be more inclined to take into account, the implications of flooding, not just now, but going into the future. Another study that's going on is for watershed management of the Rondout, the larger Rondout area. So this would affect contamination and flooding in the Rondout Creek as well. Building community awareness consensus, obviously a task force like this, with a number of meetings actually spanning a 6-month period of time, is a great way to build that consensus. We've got a website. We're putting it out. We're using Facebook. We're putting it out there in a lot of ways to get people engaged. We're planning for the future with this. Obviously, this will lead to a reevaluation of code and zoning. There are two things that are happening that will drive that as well. This is a local waterfront. It's in the local waterfront revitalization program at DOS. This waterfront area. So, but the city of Kingston is also right now involved in a comprehensive master plan process. The last one we did was in the 60s, so it's about time we did it again. And of course, I'm sure you know, the comprehensive master plan is something that ultimately would be adopted by Common Council and would incorporate zoning, a revision of zoning, revision of code for the whole community. Obviously, we have real opportunities in this to incorporate in the vision for the city moving forward, and also codify that. Let's see. Well, I just mentioned some of those. Alphabet soup, right? But it's all really important for us because it also kind of often relates to funding that we can access from the Department of State or from the Estuary Program and other sources. And again, this comprehensive master plan, though, is really, I put that at the top of the list because it's so critical to us right now. We're actually halfway into it, but we're actively trying to pull this in and inform it with stormwater management plan, titled Rondout Watershed Management Plan that we're working on. One step that we're going to be taking going forward soon, too, is we got another grant for, it's a brownfield opportunity area. It's another program of DOS. And there's a 70 acres of the waterfront will be studied for that GEIS. Of course, that's a really important step for developing the waterfront, because it will help us make better decisions, obviously, but it will also grease the skids for developers, and while at the same time it will make sure that we do the right thing by public and for the natural resources that we have down there. Hazard mitigation strategies. I want to mention that one because I think like many of the communities, we went for FEMA money, and not only is it to repair damage from the storms, we had damage to the sewage treatment plant. The water came up, and pumps and electrical equipment, various things in the sewage treatment plant were submerged. Well, there was damage. Now the problem is we can just replace those units, but then we'll damage again. So there's hazard mitigation money also, and it's something on the order of $3.3 million is going to be our request for repairs and hazard mitigation going forward. If we do the right things in terms of hazard mitigation, we may not have so much damage, obviously, through 2100 that was in that other slide. We'll want to reduce that down and down and down. And maybe we want to relocate the sewage treatment plant. It was built in the 30s. But in the meantime, we want to deal with the storms we might see this year. So, funding mechanisms, alphabet soup, there are a lot of them. And many of you may have looked for funding for your own communities like this. I've already mentioned some of these. The state has just really been so helpful in Kingston, the Department of State, Department of Environmental Conservation, and so on. But there is also funding, HUD money. We're an entitlement community, so we have community development block grants that can help do some of this or help cover repayment of low-interest loans. The cost of capital is very, it's a good time to borrow money right now. So we're looking at the different things that we can do in the community and different funding mechanisms going forward to pay for that, whether it's a grant, low-interest loan, and then how to cover that. The Greenway Conservancy has been really helpful. We have a local development corporation in Kingston, so that's another kind of mechanism we can use. It's a 501c3, but it has attributes that allow us to do certain things the municipality couldn't do or another nonprofit might not be able to do. Private financing. Actually, in the question period, if there's any questions about any of these funding sources, rather than digging into them for this, please ask. Other important activities are Kingston Conservation Advisory Council. We have one, and it was established by the Common Council. I'm on that Conservation Advisory Council. We established we have a climate action plan that stemmed from, because we're a climate smart community, we created a climate action plan. And of course that, in a bigger way, is reducing greenhouse gases, a lot of things that you can do in your community to save energy. And one piece of it certainly is what we do on the waterfront here with this task force. We're doing a natural resources inventory now, open space plan, and working with a planning board, and all those things again feed into the comprehensive master plan. I think it's, working with a municipality like Kingston, this might be a small city, but there are a lot of things, if we can align them right, will help us get the best result and really make a vision for the future happen. So finally, the wrap up is really, and you might join me up here, Libby, but the Hudson River Estuary Program, I just have to say, is a very important program in a lot of ways on the various grants that it provides. One thing I might mention, I think I saw Gretchen Reed here. I was a participant with the Hudsonia's biodiversity assessment training. Incredible training over 10 months. The Environmental Protection Fund, I can't say enough about that. And then, fortunately, this year was $134 million to $154 million. So there's more money to do a lot of the things that we're talking about here that are related, sometimes directly and sometimes not as directly. So, anything else you'd like to say?
No, we presented you with the flooding task force process, and Gregg did a great job of giving the municipal perspective and some things you can do on the ground. And so we'll just take questions.